In Japan, there is a legend of a great buried treasure.
You would be talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of gold coins in today's money.
It is the supposed fortune of a mighty warlord, buried deep in the mountains.
It's in a bit of Japan that's pretty much ignored.
This warlord, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, was the last of his kind, the last shogun of Japan.
The shogunate stayed for 250 years, 15 generations.
The key to his riches lay with a faithful servant who carried his secret to the grave.
He was just rounded up suddenly and decapitated.
Two rival families are locked in a race to find this fabulous treasure.
It was such an important part of Japan's history. If only you could dig up some bit from the time.
Their quest would bridge generations, lasting more than a century, and capture the imagination of a country.
This just kind of fed into people's desire to believe in some kind of fantasy.
This is the story of an extraordinary treasure hunt, a bitter rivalry, and a fortune beyond imagination. The lost treasure of the last shogun. At the turn of the 21st century, an elderly man spent his last days digging deep in the mountains of central Japan. He was looking for gold.
Japan is very mountainous, so there's huge numbers of areas where potentially somebody could have gone and sequestered some stuff.
His name was Miso Tomoyuki. The fortune he sought was a treasure that was lost almost 140 years previously.
According to the most popular version of the legends, there were originally over 4 or 5 million coins total. So you would be talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of gold coins in today's money.
Miso Tomoyuki had spent his entire life on a quest for this vast hoard of coins, and felt he was on the verge of an extraordinary breakthrough.
We, Mizuno, can dig for 3, 4, 5, even 100 generations, because warriors from the samurai days entrusted this to us. If we hadn't been entrusted with this, it would be just some treasure hunt, and I would have stopped long ago. I'm not that stupid.
Where did all this money come from, and why did it mysteriously vanish? The roots of the legend stretch back to a time of great upheaval. 1866. For 263 years, one family, the House of Tokugawa, held the reins of power. They seized the country in a violent insurrection, then brought centuries of peace to this wild land.
Historically, it's been very hard to hold the country together. It always falls apart. Civil wars repeatedly take place. If you imagine Switzerland, where you have mountain, valley, torrent, another mountain, another torrent, and imagine that continuing from Stockholm to Naples. That's what Japan is.
So far, there had been 15 generations of Tokugawa rulers, but they were not emperors. They were shoguns.
Shogun literally means barbarian subduing generalissimo. And it's a title that is given to someone officially by the emperor who lives in Kyoto.
The latest of this long line was Tokugawa Yoshinobu. In theory, he was a military commander who served at the emperor's pleasure. In practice, he ruled supreme, and all bowed to him. From his ancestral home at Edo Castle, the shogun governed with the aid of a vast aristocratic class, the samurai. It was an ancient feudal system that had endured for centuries.
The shogunal system was created early in the 17th century, and the first shogun was deified. That made it very difficult ever to change anything that he had set in place.
From his exalted position, the shogun not only held the reins of power, but wealth beyond imagination. At his court, a group of his most loyal and trusted samurai were given the task of administering his vast fortune. One of them was a man named Oguri Tadamasa.
Oguri Tadamasa is what's called a bannerman. He's one of about 5,000 mid-ranking samurai who are loyal to the Tokugawa Shogunate and really function as mid-level bureaucrats in the regime.
He was well-educated bureaucrat, come from a decent family. When he was young, people very quickly realized he had both mastered the military skills but also kind of literature and poetry and things like that, which was what you needed in order to have legitimacy in the top levels of the Japanese bureaucracy.
Oguri reached an exalted position as the shogun's commissioner of finance. His role was to account for the huge sums paid to the shogun in taxation. Every warlord owed the shogun an annual tribute, and all that wealth passed through Oguri's hands.
Essentially, he was the accountant for the Tokugawa regime itself. And this was a very important position because the Tokugawa shogunate needed money not only to pay all of its samurai, but to manage any reforms that they wanted to pursue.
Oguri knew that reforms were badly needed. Life in Japan had barely changed in 200 years. Yet beyond her shores, the world was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Oguri was one of the few Japanese who had been abroad and seen the benefits this brought to Western nations. He developed grand plans to modernize his deeply traditional society.
Oguri was just stunned by how far behind Japan was in terms of modern infrastructure. He wanted to create a postal system, he wanted to create a shipyard to kind of imitate what the West had. So he was one of the most vocal supporters of westernization, if you will.
But the shogun was not interested in change. And while he continued to live in splendor, the rest of Japan struggled in dire poverty.
95% of people, they were living in little miserable huts in the countryside as they had done for 1,000 years. They never left their village. Life was hard and miserable and cold in winter and hot in summer, and they died young.
This imbalance bred a wave of resentment that slowly spread through the country. A group of disaffected warlords, banished to the farthest corners of Japan, began to plot against the shogun.
One starts to get already feelings that the shogunate's outlasted its usefulness, and there comes a movement to return power to the emperor.
The conspirators were deeply loyal to the 16-year-old Emperor Meiji. In 1868, they hatch a plot to restore him to power and grab the wealth of the shogun for themselves. Encouraged by his growing band of supporters, Meiji orders the shogun to resign and sends his troops to remove him. The response from the shogun is not what anyone expected.
When the shogunate collapses, it's actually quite startling. The shogun kind of like retires. He doesn't kill himself, he doesn't set the city on fire, he just goes off and lives in the country for the rest of his life.
The shogun was gone. Without their master's protection, all of the Tokugawa retainers were in great danger. None more so than Oguri Tadamasa, the man in charge of the shogun's treasury. Oguri knew that the Meiji forces would be coming for him. They desperately wanted the shogun's vast wealth, and he would be tortured and killed in their efforts to find it. So he too fled the castle. But far from saving his own life, Oguri put himself at even greater risk. His flight sparked a rumor that would make him imperial enemy number one.
When Oguri was moving out, he had a lot of luggage with him. Some of those boxes were coin boxes, of course. So people thought that there must be coins in there.
Oguri escaped just in time.
When the emperor's forces arrive in Edo Castle, they immediately go into the treasuries and find that there are no coins there at all.
The treasuries were empty. The vast wealth of the Shogun had vanished.
The Meiji forces just can't believe that there's no money at all. Someone must have the money somewhere. In one of the famous stories, they ask one of the Tokugawa samurai, "Where's all the money?" He tells them, "I don't know, but you should ask Oguri, the commissioner of finance."
But where was Oguri? And where could he have hidden such a large cache of money?
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit gives you access to a growing range of documentaries presented by and featuring historians at the forefront of research and debate. Whether you are looking to find out more about charismatic leaders like Cleopatra or to discover the story behind the Industrial Revolution, History Hit will have something for you. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
It came to their attention that Oguri had disappeared. There were also some rumours at the time from witnesses who claimed to have seen a man getting off of a boat in Gunma Prefecture, laden, and going off and potentially hiding something.
Gunma Prefecture was Oguri's ancestral home. It was a wild region, about 100 miles inland from Edo.
Gunma is a fairly high area with many mountainous plateaus. It's wild, it's far from everywhere.
It's very rural. It's in a bit of Japan that's pretty much ignored.
In other words, it was the ideal location to conceal a fortune. Oguri was now hiding here, in a Buddhist temple on the slopes of a dormant volcano, Mount Akagi. The rumor that he had millions of coins in his possession made him a marked man. A matter of days after his arrival, people came to rob him.
A group of about 10 gangsters or so whip up a mob of up to 700 people, and they essentially send a messenger to Oguri telling him to hand over all of the money that he has. Oguri sends a messenger with about 50 coins and says, "Look, this is really all I have." They don't believe him, and this mob attacks the temple where Oguri is staying, and Oguri and his retainers rout the mob and kill many of the gangsters.
Oguri and a small band of servants survive this attack in a stunning display of martial skill. But it was a hollow victory. Emperor Meiji now saw him as a serious threat to the new regime. Anyone with so much might and so much money had to be eliminated.
Because Oguri demonstrated that he has some kind of military expertise, and he has retainers with him and also village men with him who know how to fight, it is thought by the Meiji forces that perhaps Oguri is plotting to launch a counterattack.
A detachment of the emperor's best samurai are sent to kill Oguri. He was declared an outlaw on the spot and summarily sentenced to death.
But because Oguri was just rounded up suddenly and accused of being a criminal, he was just decapitated.
The next day, Oguri's family and the last of his loyal followers are rounded up too. They are also executed. The only ones who knew the treasure's whereabouts were dead. Yet from the ashes of Oguri's household, the legend of the lost treasure of the last Shogun was born. With the restoration of the emperor, Japan entered a brave new world.
After the Meiji Emperor took over, Japan changed dramatically, incredibly quickly. It was full-on modernization.
The feudal system was abolished. Old Edo was renamed Tokyo, and Japan leaped into the white heat of the Industrial Revolution. The world of the Shogun was consigned to history.
When the Meiji regime came to power, they had to villainize the previous regime. So the Tokugawa was turned into a kind of dark, primitive, unprogressive, feudal time.
Within a few short years, Oguri Tadamasa was all but forgotten. Though ironically his ideas about shipyards, postal systems, and other newfangled technology were adopted wholesale. But one man could not let go of the past. His name was Nakajima Kurando. He would be the first in a long line of treasure hunters.
Nakajima Kurando supposedly worked within the Commission of Finance as a very low-ranking bureaucrat.
This petty bureaucrat claimed he was a noble samurai and one of Oguri Tadamasa's most loyal retainers. Somehow, he escaped death at the hands of the emperor's men, and he knew about the existence of the hidden gold. Sometime in the late 1870s, he began to search for it. He believed it was somewhere in the wild terrain of Mount Akagi, where his master Oguri had died several years earlier. He enlisted an American railwayman, one of thousands of foreigners trying to make their fortune in the new Japan. The American had two things that Nakajima needed: money to fund an expedition, and dynamite to blast into the hard rock of the mountain.
Nakajima buys land and says to this American, "Here, I found this gold coin and there's more of it up there. You can go digging in there and find it."
The pair dug together for months. However, no gold was found. Believing he had been duped, the American sued Nakajima. And Nakajima was sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud. After his release, this once proud samurai was destitute. He was left homeless on the streets of Tokyo and had to seek shelter with some old family friends, the Misonos. During his stay in the Misono house, Nakajima quickly made an impression with several members of the family, especially Mrs. Misono and her oldest son, Tomoyoshi.
Misono Tomoyoshi was a young man. He remembers Nakajima essentially having an illicit relationship with his mother after his father died.
For some months, Nakajima continued as a live-in lover for Mrs. Misono. In that time, he also became an inspiration to her son. Tomoyoshi came to regard him as a stepfather. Yet despite their close relationship, Nakajima kept the legend of the gold a closely guarded secret. Then, without warning, Nakajima strangely vanished. Tomoyoshi took the disappearance particularly hard. He assumed he would never again hear from the man he once called his dad. He was wrong. A decade after he went missing, Nakajima Kurando broke his silence.
One day, after not seeing Nakajima for some 10 years, a letter suddenly arrives.
In the letter, Nakajima explains that he is dying. He begs Tomoyoshi's forgiveness and pleads for his adopted son to come to see him one last time. He had to tell Tomoyoshi a secret about the lost treasure of the last shogun.
So Misono Tomoyoshi visits Nakajima as he's sick and dying, and is essentially given a bunch of documents and told to go find the gold.
When they met, Nakajima revealed that in all his years away, he had been desperately searching for the hidden treasure. To Tomoyoshi's utter amazement, Nakajima asked him to continue the quest and gave him all of his research.
It doesn't have a map and it doesn't say the treasure is here, but it supposedly has all these puzzles that'll help him find the treasure.
Just days after this encounter, Nakajima died. Tomoyoshi was shocked at the secret life of his stepfather. To him, the whole idea of the quest seemed ludicrous. Mount Akagi is 6,000 feet high and covers hundreds of square miles. The gold could be anywhere, and Nakajima's documents offered no concrete information. But around the turn of the 20th century, his life took a dramatic turn.
It seems that the real tipping point for Mizuno was when his wife suddenly died of pneumonia.
In the wake of this devastating loss, Tomoyoshi fell back on the legacy of the lost treasure and threw himself into Nakajima's cryptic research.
He essentially has an emotional crisis, sells his business, sells his house, and moves out to Mount Akagi in Gunma Prefecture to begin buying land and looking for the treasure.
Tomoyoshi made a solemn vow to carry on Nakajima's quest for the lost treasure of the Shogun. It wasn't long before he made a breakthrough in deciphering some of the arcane riddles, and that, in turn, led to his first real discovery.
He claims to have found a small gold statue. He also claims to have these copper plates that have markings on them and a little map.
Tomoyoshi's entire life was now dedicated to the search for gold.
He goes around and tells people that he has these things in order to get money to continue digging for the gold in Mount Akagi.
For almost 40 years, he dug and dug and dug. He even found a new wife who agreed to help him in his search and started a family. All the while, with no job to speak of, Tomoyoshi burned through the savings he built up from his previous life.
When he starts off, he's rather wealthy. He was a real estate guy in Tokyo, and he had a lot of money with him when he first moved out there, but he gradually ran out of money.
The quest for the treasure bankrupted Tomoyoshi. But whatever troubles he had, he ignored them. He was obsessed with only one thing: finding the Shogun's gold. Yet no matter how deep he went, no matter how carefully he scrutinized the clues in his growing pile of documents, he found nothing. In 1926, Mizuno Tomoyoshi died, heartbroken and penniless. Tomoyoshi's son, Mizuno Aizaburo, was a policeman who wanted nothing to do with buried treasure. But Aizaburo's mother was desperate to continue the search. She begged Aizaburo to carry on the family quest.
After Tomoyoshi dies, Tomoyoshi's wife tells her son, look, your father felt that you were the one who really should be digging for treasure, and so she gives Aizaburo all of the documents that Tomoyoshi had.
Aizaburo felt he had no choice but to honor his father's wishes. He quit his job and moved to Mount Akagi. The torch had passed to a new generation.
In a way, this tradition of treasure hunting has become associated with the Mizuno family, so they're the experts, and they have this lineage as well.
Aizaburo had inherited all of Nakajima Kurando's documents, and still more research that his father had done in 40 years of searching. Still, no gold had yet been found. and the vast bulk of Mount Akagi remained unexplored. Where to start?
He does continue, in some part, digging some of the tunnels that his father had started, but through his own research, he also starts digging other tunnels around Mount Akagi.
After just a few months of digging, some valuable new clues were uncovered.
And they do find this kind of stone tortoise with strange writing on it, and they see that as a sign that this is a clue that will lead us closer to the treasure.
Aizaburo's search continued into the 1930s, but as he dug on, Japan was changing around him. The country harbored vast imperial ambitions, and it was marching steadily towards war. At this time, there was a newfound interest in Oguri Tadamasa, the last shogun's most fervent modernizer, and the source of the shogun's treasure legend.
In the late 1920s and early 1930s, there's an Oguri boom. He really becomes a kind of national hero, a supporter of the Japanese Navy, and there are lots of books and biographies written about him.
One man decided to use Oguri's newly restored good name for his own ends, to seek out the shogun's missing fortune. He was called Kawahara Hidemori. Now the Mizunos had a rival, and the race to find the treasure was heating up.
Kawahara Hidemori decides to claim that he is the grandson of an illicit relationship between Oguri and some mistress.
As Oguri's illegitimate grandson, Kawahara believed only he had the right to search for the shogun's treasure. He had been researching likely burial sites for years. But before he could begin his dig, he needed to raise a substantial amount of money. In 1934, he launched a publicity drive. Taking advantage of the nationalist sentiment of the day, Kawahara arranged a press conference at the Buddhist temple where the severed head of Oguri Tadamasa was supposedly buried.
He becomes very popular in the 1930s among treasure hunters. He shows up with a kimono with the Oguri family crest on it and essentially says that he's here to, help find the treasure.
Before a small crowd at the temple, Kawahara promised to completely refurbish it in Oguri's memory and donate the rest of the money to the nation, minus his own cut for expenses, of course. But then the chief monk of the temple unexpectedly intervened. He had been watching Kawahara's performance and didn't believe a word. He stepped in front of the crowd himself to denounce Kawahara as a fraud. In the monk's opinion, Kawahara was definitely not Oguri's grandson, and Oguri himself would not have approved of this whole charade. Still, many members of the Japanese public bought into his story and gave money. Kawahara also attracted one major sponsor, a shady pachinko gambling boss. Awash with money, Kawahara began his own dig for the treasure. Unlike the Mizuno family, he claimed the gold was not on Mount Akagi, but in a small village to the southwest of Tokyo. Like his rivals, Kawahara dug for many fruitless years. Nothing stopped his relentless quest or the flow of money from well-wishers. Not even the Second World War. Indeed, his promise to donate any gold he found to the Japanese nation was a source of hope in those turbulent years.
Throughout the war and even into the 1950s, Kawahara continues to dig in all sorts of places south of Tokyo and earns a lot of money from people who he convinces that this story is true.
By the early 1960s, Kawahara had been searching for almost 30 years. Now Japan was undergoing a massive economic revival. and Kawahara's gambling boss patron, was a rich man. His change in fortunes helped take the expedition to a new level.
In this period, Japan forms an economic miracle. It's absolutely incredible. And the middle class expands, and everybody seems to be doing incredibly well out of this economic nationalism.
Unlike the Misonos, struggling in poverty, Kawahara could afford to delve far underground. He dug a deep mine with an electric lift and the latest groundwater pumps to keep the site dry. He also had 13 workers to help him excavate. With these new resources, he raced ahead in the contest to uncover the gold. He dug down 250 feet to the supposed location of the great chests of coins. But, despite his well-financed operation, Kawahara Hidemori, the alleged illegitimate grandson of Oguri, was unable to find any treasure. In 1967, he died, but still, the legend of the treasure lived on.
People were aware of this idea of the Tokugawa treasure. In the 1970s, the Yomiuri newspaper ran a massive series on this idea of hidden treasure. Every single article said, well, this is the legend and nothing's been found. This is the legend, but nothing's been found. These people were searching and they didn't find anything. But this went on and on and on for 16 separate articles.
Rumors of buried treasure rumbled on for decades after Kawahara's death, and the legend became part of Japanese popular culture. But it was not until the 1990s that another serious effort was made to find it. This time, it was the Misonos, the rival treasure-hunting family, that would come closer than ever to unlocking the mystery of the Shogun's lost fortune. 2 generations of the family, Tomoyoshi and his son Aizaburo, had been digging on the slopes of Mount Akagi for nearly a century. Now a 3rd generation of Misono treasure hunters was about to enter the game. Misono Tomoyuki, the son of Aizaburo. Like his father and his grandfather before him, he was highly skeptical of the legend.
Initially, he did not want any part of the treasure hunting. He thought it was a total sham. He didn't believe that the Tokugawa shogunate would have buried gold coins, and basically he went off on his own in Tokyo and worked in a variety of jobs.
But Tomoyuki could not resist the pull of the quest that his family had been pursuing since the late 19th century. It was not simply a question of finding the money. It was a matter of family honor.
There's the weight of carrying on the family tradition, which is established in Japanese culture and history and society. This idea of you trying very, very hard until the end, this idea of gambaru, which means to work hard. You will persevere through whatever comes along, and you will ultimately succeed in the end. This is very much instilled in people in Japan at a very, very early age.
Tomoyuki decided that he must follow in the footsteps of his forebears and give up his day job in Tokyo. He swore to dedicate his life to the completion of this epic quest.
Was just attracted by the legacy of his father and his grandfather. And he also became convinced because of all these old documents that his grandfather had from the 19th century. So he began doing research on his own and began digging a whole separate series of tunnels separate from his father and grandfather.
Tomoyuki's quest coincided with a new time of upheaval in Japan. The economy had collapsed, and a national mood of depression set in. The Japanese media began casting around for a hero.
The 1990s is called the Lost Decade.
Japan's lost decade is about economic stagnation. One should remember that that stagnation came after a protracted period of enormous growth, which could not have been maintained forever.
Not only was there economic crisis, but there was political scandal, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack in Tokyo. And this just kind of fed into people's desire to believe in some kind of fantasy.
And what better fantasy than the legendary lost treasure of the Shogun? One enterprising television network called Misono Tomoyuki to see if he wanted to be on TV.
In the early 1990s, there was a Japanese entertainment show appropriately called Gimme a Break.
It follows a pattern of Japanese television shows that you still get today. It'll have a number of celebrities interviewing other celebrities, music, animation, sketches, all put together in a 2-hour format.
A Japanese copywriter who grew up in Gunma was familiar with the legend, and he decided to produce a show about the treasure hunting in Mount Akagi.
In their call to Tomoyuki, the producers explained they wanted to cast him and his family as modern-day heroes, men determined to succeed in the face of insurmountable odds. Men who embodied the noble idea of Ganbaro.
It's entirely sensible for them to get in contact with the Misonos and try and use their expertise, but also to legitimize what they're doing. They're not just rushing off into Gunma Prefecture with a load of cranes and digging holes. They've got the guy, and he's the person who's going to make sure we do this properly.
It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The producers of Gimme a Break got a never-ending real-life soap opera to inspire the nation. In return, Tomoyuki received more resources than he could ever dream of. After years in the wilderness, the Misonos were back, with the best chance they would ever have of striking gold.
The Misono, they've been searching for 120 years and haven't found anything. If a TV producer says to you, we're going to give you 12 cranes and loads of digging equipment, would you like to get on board? I mean, for him, this is a huge boon, because he doesn't have to do it on his own.
The whole nation seemed to be willing Tomoyuki on, and with his help, the TV company found gold, ratings gold.
There would be these huge backhoes and cranes that would dig this enormous pit, almost the size of a rock quarry. And they would find these horizontal tunnels, and so they would go digging in there, and then some earth would fall in a funny way, and they would say, aha, someone must have buried something there. They would find a few bottles, which was an indication that perhaps Oguri's French connections had wine out here and dropped a bottle long ago.
Altogether, the network revisited the Mount Akagi treasure site 10 times in the 1990s, each time with a more elaborate and expensive effort to find the hidden treasure.
When they find lots and lots of tunnels, what they're finding are the tunnels that were dug in the 1930s in order to find the treasure. But that is conveniently left out of the story because it's not very exciting.
This was no longer about logic, it was about magic. Fueled by growing viewer numbers, the search soon became completely detached from reality.
When more money started coming in to produce the show, they hired a few American psychics to come over. They flew over Mount Akagi in a helicopter to try to feel the psychic power of where the treasure would be buried. They also hired an esoteric Buddhist monk to pray to the ancestors to find where the treasure was. And each episode ended with a cliffhanger that, something had just been found. So that would get people to watch the next time.
In the final installment, in 1999, the dig reached fever pitch. By now, the Misono excavation works resembled something like an open-cast mine. It descended fully 200 feet below the surface of the mountain. A network of tunnels, dug over generations by the Misonos, went down even further still. In one final dramatic push, a huge industrial mining drill was brought in to dig still further, hoping to find a hidden cavern containing the gold. But the media frenzy had overwhelmed Tomoyuki. He came to believe the TV company did not care about the treasure itself. All they wanted was a grand spectacle to please their audience.
It seems that in the later episodes, Misono felt that they were going on the wrong track. And he almost felt that there was a rivalry between this team and his own search. And he eventually dropped out of the project altogether.
The TV audience soon began to dwindle, and the show was eventually cancelled. Tomoyuki was alone once more, and still, he pressed on with his dig.
There was always some aspect, something that made them feel like we're almost 90% there, and so he couldn't give up.
Meanwhile, the Mizuno's rivals for the treasure, the Kawahara family, had been laboring away 140 miles to the south, largely under the radar since the death of Kawahara Hidemori in 1967. The quest to find the lost treasure had passed from old Hidemori to his son, Kawahara Jiro. In his early digs, Jiro made a number of discoveries, which he claimed were clear evidence that the gold itself was only a few meters further down.
He claims to have found little objects here and there, and those objects he gives as proof that he's closer to the treasure legend, and of course that makes it easier for him to convince people to give him money.
Among the objects he found were human bones and other Tokugawa-era artifacts, pointing towards the treasure's location. In the year 2000, Jiro took a leaf from his father's book and launched a publicity drive. Just like his father, the thing he wanted was money. The press descended on the same location where his father had appeared almost 70 years before. There, they witnessed Kawahara unveiling a bronze sword and a golden coin, dating from the time of the Tokugawa Shogunate. But however much Jiro insisted his artifacts were genuine, the public was now quite skeptical of the whole story.
When experts look at the objects, they find out that essentially these are objects that he bought at a local antique store.
Jiro's claim to be on the verge of finding the treasure was widely denounced, and he seemed to have little hard evidence to back his story up. The Kawahara family's hunt for the treasure was over. The latest generation, Jiro's son, has abandoned the quest completely.
The youngest member of the family wants absolutely nothing to do with his father's search for buried treasure and is actually quite embarrassed by it.
But what of Mizuno Tomoyuki, the unlikely star of Gimme a Break? In 2006, another filmmaker caught up with him. These are some of the extraordinary images he captured. Now a wizened old man dying of cancer, the proud treasure hunter felt he had been cursed by 2 generations of his family. He could not give up his quest, ever.
But that's the star I've been born under with this family. I have this sense of responsibility that I have to do this. That's why I do it. Is there anyone else who has this kind of responsibility? If so, I'd like to meet them. Is there anyone else in Japan who has been entrusted by the samurai of the past?
Someone asked him once, what would you do if you found the treasure? And he said, I would kick it really hard because my family struggled and lost a lot of money and energy in finding this. But he just felt that it was his destiny, his fate, to find this treasure. A fate that no one else but he and his family would be able to fulfill.
After almost 140 years of searching, no one has yet found any gold. So does the treasure really exist? Or was the legend just that?
There has been a lot of stories about the shogunate, the kind of shogunate that wouldn't die. It was such an important part of Japan's history. There's a kind of romantic feeling we don't want it to go away. Only you could dig up some bit from the time.
Despite all of the research done down the years by the Mizuno family, a more objective examination of the facts show that, in all likelihood, there was no money buried in the first place.
There's absolutely no evidence and no possibility that there was buried treasure anywhere.
This is because, in Japan, during the shogunate, gold coins were not used as a measure of wealth.
It's a sort of a Western notion that you have a kind of a jewel tower in which you put all these rich things, and as long as they're in there, you're rich. But for Japan, you're simply having gold sitting in a tower was not of a great deal of use to anyone.
Instead, the great lords of the era counted their riches using a different material: rice.
The standard unit of exchange was rice. And rice is a wonderful unit of exchange because if you get hungry, you can eat it, but also it can be broken up into any sizes. Also, it lasts for quite a long time. And the principal unit of rice was what they call a koku. And a koku, it's enough to sustain an adult for a year.
A junior samurai might earn 100 koku a year. The higher up the social scale he was, the more koku he would be entitled to as tribute from the farmers on his land. The leading lords, such as the Shogun himself, would have each claimed more than 1 million koku annually. In fact, the entire class structure of Japan during the shogunate was built around the growing and storage of rice. This was helpful for feeding armies. But when it came to acquiring desirable goods like silk, pottery, or weapons, rice was useless.
The samurai class are paid in rice yield. The merchants operate in coin. You can't buy things with rice, so that the merchants change rice into coin, and they take a rake off, and over time, the amount of coin you get for your rice goes down. The samurai class are increasingly impoverished.
In time, even the shogun himself found his vast stockpiles of rice were worth barely a handful of gold coins. So when the revolution came, he could not afford to defend himself.
One of the reasons why the Tokugawa regime falls is because it doesn't have cash to pay its allies for continued military support. If they had any money at all, the Tokugawa shogunate would have been using it to fund their defense against their warlords.
So the question then remains, if there was no gold, why would anyone spend so much time and effort to try and find a treasure that never really existed?
I think they really believed in this legacy. Especially Miso Tomoyuki felt that this was just the destiny of his family, that there was too much in terms of 100-year-old documents to really just give it up.
Regardless of how much Miso Tomoyuki believed in the legend, he could not convince his children that the gold really existed. He would be the last in his family's long line of treasure hunters.
He has 3 adult children. None of them have expressed any interest at all in continuing this Mizuno family legacy of searching for the treasure.
Tomoyuki was utterly alone in his quest. But even though he had no one to help him, he continued to dig until his very last days. In 2010, Mizuno Tomoyuki died. The search for the lost treasure of the last shogun died with him.